What's up, friends? Welcome back to the Pack a Day podcast. I'm your host, Andy Herman. You can follow me on Twitter at Andy Herman NFL. Thanks so much for joining me today. Today, we are going to be looking at 7 additional offseason scenarios. I'm just kidding. We're not actually going to do that. I really appreciate you following along with me for the previous series where we did go through 4 of those scenarios. Had a lot of fun doing that. Had a lot of great feedback. So really appreciate that. But today, we're going to be going in a different direction. Spreadsheet Andy is taking a day off. And today, we're going to go through my grades. For those of you who are unfamiliar, this is my 6th consecutive season of grading every single Green Bay Packer on every single play on offense and defense and compiling my grades through the course of the year. So when you get to the end, there's a lot of really fun data that you can go through. Most improved, best player, worst player, best player at each position. So we'll take a deep dive today into my grades for the season. Usually I do this a little bit closer to when the season ended, but just kind of how the episodes kind of ended up, going through the course of this past week. Really wanted to get to some of those off-season scenarios before the off-season kicked off, and all of a sudden I wasn't able to get to them. So today we'll be looking at all of my grades and kind of all the kind of cool details that you can kind of glean from going through this. And like I said, grades are never perfect, right? Everyone's going to have different evaluations of players on a specific play. Obviously, I don't know what play is being called on every play. You can glean a lot from watching all 11 players and what they're trying to do. But there's still, if you watch every player and every play, there is a ton that you can take away from it. And this is the results of this year's grading the pack. So without further ado, let's start by going over the MVP. Now, this is usually a very easy exercise. Who graded the highest through the season? That's easy, right? And usually there's somebody, normally Aaron Rodgers. Devontae Adams was very close for a couple seasons. That's like plus 20. And it's just like a very obvious, okay, here's the MVP of the season. This year, there wasn't that player. My highest graded player on the season was plus 5.25. Somebody that wouldn't even garner usually top 10 or top 5 at least recognition for MVP. This year it did. It was my highest graded player, and that was Aaron Jones, plus 5.25. Clearly, he had some key fumbles in key games. Down in the stretch against the Lions, he had a really tough one against the Buccaneers that could have cost them. I don't think this was Aaron Jones' best season, partially because they didn't play him enough, partially because he had some key fumbles, but still, when all the grades were compiled at the end of the year, Aaron Jones had the highest grade. That being said, the highest graded player on a per snap basis was by far and away Rashawn Gary. Rashawn Gary ended up within a point of Aaron Jones, despite not playing as many games. Now, you could argue it's tough to say Rashawn Gary's the MVP when they had a losing record, like by far when he was in, and he only played a little more than half the season. I want to say somewhere around there. So, it's tough to give it to Gary when, even when their 4-game win streak at the end of the year, he's not even in there and playing, right? So, like I said, it's difficult to give it to Gary when he just didn't play enough. But if you want to go on a per snap basis, my highest graded player on the year almost undoubtedly would have been Rashawn Gary had it not been for the injury and him going out with the torn ACL. So I'm inclined just to give it to Aaron Jones because he ended up with the most, the higher grade than anyone else. But on a per play basis, it was clearly Rashawn Gary. So either one, at the end of the day, my highest graded offensive player was Aaron Jones. My highest graded defensive player was Rashawn Gary. So whichever one you want to give it to, I would certainly understand. But those are my offensive and defensive players of the year. My rookie of the year was Christian Watson, plus 3.95 grade. If you would have taken away his first game against the Vikings, he ends up being the highest graded player on the season, like bar none. Like that first game against the Vikings, and if he would have been able to play a few more games and not been injured, he would have run away with this year's award. So that just goes to show, and again, assuming Rashawn Gary still got hurt, but he was phenomenal throughout his time, basically since the Cowboys game on. He was an absolute stud. He really showed what he's capable of, not only in his breakout game against the Cowboys, but even going against that last game against Detroit, being the guy who put up 100 plus yards, came up with key catches, the key contested catch, even as he was pass interfered with, some key first down conversions. So I really thought Christian Watson showed exactly what he's capable of on a high end side, the 3 touchdown game against the Cowboys, but he showed me that he has staying power as well. By far and away, my rookie of the year. My most improved player, now this is players who played at least 200 snaps in 2021 and in 2022. there wasn't really anyone that stood out and it's just like, holy cow, this player got so much better. But Josiah DeGuara was the one who had 200 snaps in both seasons, who improved the most with a net gain of plus 2.15 points year over year from 2021 to 2022. So DeGuara ends up being the most improved player. The player who regressed the most may not surprise you, and unfortunately, it was Aaron Rodgers. We can go into all of the reasons why. Offensive line play, no Devontae Adams, no MVS, receivers hurt to start the season, working with a lot of rookies. This offense just didn't click, broken thumb, broken ribs. We can go over all of it. At the end of the day, his grade was nowhere near. In fact, it dropped 20.85 points year over year from 21 to 22. So a huge drop off. Not just on Aaron, part of that is the pieces around him as well, but there was a massive drop off. And remember, not grading a negative for Aaron if he has pressure in his lap, if there's not a receiver open down the field, if somebody else screws something up. There could be an incomplete pass to the sideline that was a positively graded play, but even one that he threw away because it was the right decision on the play. There can be an incomplete pass that Christian Watson drops for a would-be touchdown in the game against Minnesota that is an extremely positive grade for Aaron Rodgers on the play because he threw a perfect ball that should have been a huge touchdown. Those aren't negatives for Aaron. That's not even neutral for Aaron. That's a huge positive play for Aaron. So it's just because he didn't have the same weapons and just because he didn't have the same offensive line doesn't mean that he automatically just grades in the negative. If there was no opportunity there, he doesn't garner a negative grade on that play. So the fact that he was down 20 points, 20.85 points, almost 21 points, goes a long way in describing just how different the year was from 2021 to 2022 for Aaron Rodgers. I know all the caveats. I know all the reasons behind it. But at the end of the day, whether you want to put that blame on Aaron, the surrounding cast, the cast that surrounds him, the coaching, the general manager for not giving him enough weapons, those are all different conversations that we can have. But at the end of the day, you can look at any metric, any number, any grade, PFF, myself. Aaron wasn't anywhere near the same as he was a season ago. That's an indictment of the franchise as a whole, including Aaron. So he was my player who regressed the most. My top 5 graded players on offense this year: Aaron Jones, Mercedes Lewis, David Bakhtiari, Christian Watson, and Alan Lazard. Huge grades for Bakhtiari and Christian Watson when you consider that Watson was A, a rookie, but B, missed a good chunk of the season, missed a huge chunk of the offseason program. And then David Bakhtiari, not only missing the time early and just kind of working the rust off, but then the appendectomy as well. You put him in there, he's plug and play. He's a phenomenal player every single time he's out there. And for him to grade as the 3rd highest graded offensive player, coming back from that injury in minimal snaps because of some of the injuries, just a phenomenal year for David Bakhtiari when he actually was in there. My highest graded defensive players: Gary was 1, Kenny Clark was 2, Devontae Wyatt was actually 3. Now, one thing I'll mention here is anytime you have a player who didn't play like a ton of snaps, they have the opportunity to fluctuate in a much higher, way, right? So had Devontae Wyatt played 700 snaps like a starting defensive lineman, his grade probably would have been much worse. But he, for a long time, played about 9 to 10 snaps per game, made the most of those 9 or 10 snaps, usually didn't grade in the negative. In fact, graded neutral or slightly positive almost the entirety of those 9 and 10 snaps, which is easier because you're playing a player who has a ton of talent, who has fresh legs coming in, only 9 or 10 snaps. But then his last game against the Lions in the last game of the season, he was the best defender on the field that day for Green Bay. So you had this kind of neutral player who had a really nice game in his very last game, didn't play as many snaps, so the variance has the ability to be a lot more, but he ended up at the end being the 3rd highest graded player. Now he had a plus 0.9. And what this should tell you here is I only had 2 defensive players that really graded positive, like really positive. Like I would even say Wyatt, as my 3rd highest graded player, was basically neutral on the season. If I were to give a positive, neutral, or negative at plus 0.9, I would give that a neutral grade on the year. Gary and Clark, the only ones who had legitimate positive grades. Then Wyatt plus 0.9, Alexander plus 0.8, and then Jerron Reed plus 0.75. If you go and look at Jair Alexander, early in the season, struggled. Partially, again, if you want to blame organization, coaching, scheme, etc., he wasn't put in a great position to succeed earlier in the year. Just go look at that first Minnesota Viking game against Justin Jefferson. Like, there's a lot of different scenarios where Jair wasn't put in the right position for his skill set. But at the same time, he was allergic to tackling at the beginning of the year. We saw at the end of the year him play much more aggressive football. Like the last 5-6 games, Jair looked like all pro Jair. Like no question about it. The beginning of the year, he didn't. Because of that, it sort of evened out. You ended up in the positive, fourth highest graded defender, but nowhere near some of his other years just because it wasn't consistent throughout the course of the year. Again, not just because of Jair. Part of the reason was because of the scenario he was put in or situation he was put in. And then Jarran Reed, number 5 at plus 0.75. So highest graded offense one more time: Jones, Lewis, Bakhtiari, Watson, Lazard. Lowest 5: Gary, Clark, Wyatt, Alexander, and Jarran Reed. Top graded players by position. Quarterback, this is going to just get, I was hoping this wouldn't happen actually, but quarterback was technically Jordan Love. Go back to my Devontae Wyatt comments from just a moment ago. Had Jordan Love played the same amount of snaps as Aaron Rodgers did, my guess and my presumption would be that he would have graded well into the negative. It's a really tough situation. Maybe he wouldn't have. Maybe he would have played better. Maybe he would have played the same. Tough to say because we didn't get to see him much. But in his limited time, when he was not asked to do a whole lot, like he was in garbage time the majority of the year, he actually graded plus 0.55, which came out just slightly ahead of Aaron Rodgers. Rodgers had basically a neutral year, so did Jordan Love. But in those garbage time snaps for Jordan Love, they ended up actually slightly higher than what Rodgers was on the season. That is not to say Love is a better quarterback. That's not to say I think Love was the better player. None of that, right? Rodgers is better. If you would play a playoff game today and I had my choice between Love and Rodgers, I'm taking Rodgers, bar none, no question about it. But just because of some of the easy garbage time snaps that Jordan Love got, he ended up grading slightly higher. So highest grading quarterback was Jordan Love. Running back was Aaron Jones. Receiver was Christian Watson. Tight end Mercedes Lewis. Offensive lineman David Bakhtiari. Defensive lineman Kenny Clark. Edge rusher Rashawn Gary. Linebacker Chris Barnes. The only position group that did not have a player grade in the positive was inside linebacker. Barnes, negative 0.55. This is probably another one where if Barnes played the full season, he probably would have graded well into the negative and below what Quay would have done, below what Devondre would have done. He wouldn't have been as good as probably either of those guys, but he played less and he didn't have as many negative plays because of it. So he ends up actually the highest graded inside linebacker at negative 0.55. Jair was the highest graded corner. Rudy Ford was the highest graded safety. My lowest graded offensive players: Royce Newman, negative 5.8. Then Josh Myers, Sammy Watkins, Yosh Nijman, and Robert Tonyan. My lowest graded defensive players: Darnell Savage, Adrian Amos, Eric Stokes, Quay Walker, and Jonathan Garvin. My highest graded game of the year for the offensive side of the ball was Aaron Rodgers in week 10 with a plus 2.9 grade. My highest graded defender in any given game this year was Jarran Reed in week 16 with a plus 1.9 grade. It's the forced fumble against the Dolphins and just a monster game overall. Lowest graded individual game was Elton Jenkins in week 6 with a negative 3.3 grade. That was his still when he was at right tackle and just massively struggling. Lowest graded individual game on the defensive side of the ball was Darnell Savage in week 8 with a negative 2.05 grade. My highest graded offensive players per snap with minimum 200 snaps on the season. So had to play at least 200 snaps. This is on a per snap basis. My highest graded offensive players: Mercedes Lewis, Aaron Jones, Christian Watson, David Bakhtiari, and Josiah DeGuara. So Lewis, Jones, Watson, Bakhtiari, and DeGuara. My highest graded defensive players per snap, minimum 200 snaps: Rashawn Gary, Kenny Clark, Devontae Wyatt, Keyshawn Nixon, and Jarran Reed. So what that tells me is Josiah DeGuara, Devontae Wyatt, Keyshawn Nixon, those three probably should have played more on offense and defense respectively based on their per snap grades. Lowest graded offensive players per snap, minimum 200 snaps: Sammy Watkins was my lowest graded player per snap, then Royce Newman, then Josh Myers, Robert Tonyan, and Yosh Nijman. Sammy and Royce were just absolutely brutal. Lowest graded defensive players per snap: Eric Stokes, Darnell Savage, Kingsley Enagbare, actually, who I still think for a rookie held up really, really well, but the run defense and holding up at the point of attack just didn't go always according to plan. He ended up on the ground way too much. I think he has a very, very bright future. Love him as a pass rusher and what his skill set brings. He just needs to get more physical strength and just refine his game just a little bit, but he's really close. I really like Enagbare, but still ended up there. Quay Walker and Amos. So lowest 5 defenders again per snap: Stokes, Savage, Enagbare, Walker, and Amos. Most games graded in the positive this year. Mercedes Lewis led the way with 13 games graded in the positive. Kenny Clark had 11, Aaron Jones had 11, A.J. Dillon had 11, and Alan Lazard had 11. So your most consistent players this year, Lewis, Clark, Jones, Dillon, and Lazard. Most games graded in the negative. The two that led the way were actually Josh Myers and Preston Smith. Then Robert Tonyan, Jerron Reed, J.J. Enagbare, Quay Walker, and Savage. Myers and Smith both had 12. Tonyan, Reed, Enagbare, Walker, and Savage all had 11 games where they graded in the negative. The 4 players who improved from 2021 to 2022, we mentioned Josiah DeGuara was the highest, followed by Mercedes Lewis, Yosh Nijman, and TJ Slayton. Biggest regression from 21 to 22, we already talked about Aaron Rodgers. Then it was Adrian Amos, Kenny Clark, Devondre Campbell, and Rasul Douglas. A lot of that's because Clark was just awesome, or just better in 2021. He had a 5-game stretch in 2022 as the lowest of his career that he really struggled. But outside of that, Clark had a really nice season, just had a 5-game stretch where he just kind of disappeared for a while, unfortunately. The highest graded rookies, Christian Watson 1, followed by Devontae Wyatt. Those were the top 2. The highest graded offseason addition this past year was Jerron Reed, followed by Keyshawn Nixon. Remember, this is just offense and defense. Special teams are not factored into this. And then Rudy Ford with Sammy Watkins grading well into the negative. And then if you look at the unrestricted free agents this upcoming year, their top 2 on the list that graded in the positive were Mercedes Lewis and Alan Lazard, followed by Jerron Reed, Keyshawn Nixon, Rudy Ford, and Randall Cobb. Players that are unrestricted free agents that graded in the negative, Eric Wilson, Dean Lowry, Justin Hollins, Robert Tonyan, Adrian Amos, and then Dallin Levitt did not have any snaps on defense. So those are my grades, my key takeaways from my grades this year. Again, my 6th season doing it. Every player, every play, in every single game. These were the ultimate results. If you want to get every player's grade and a few more breakdowns and all the things that I just mentioned, go to PackerReport.com. You can get all of my grades for the entirety of the season. It is a free article through the season, during the season. All of the individual articles that I write, and as it's tabulated through the course of the year, those are paid for articles. You have to be a subscriber. This end of the year one, where it's going to give you all the final grades, it is a free article to read. So it's all out on PackerReport.com. That is going to do it for me today. Thank you so much for joining me. I will be right back here tomorrow with an all new episode. So make sure to subscribe if you haven't already. But until next time, and as always, go Pack Go.